I mean, I think the point is that, you know, we all expect the truth from our elected leaders, and that's all I'm really asking for. Let's speak to Michael Mansfield, KC, barrister of some renown. He spent his career taking on some of the most controversial cases of our times, including the Birmingham Six, Bloody Sunday, the striking miners, Stephen Lawrence, Hillsborough, Grenfell. I think he's been involved in the Salisbury poisoning case as well. Michael, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for joining us. I mean, we're having a bit of a roustabout this morning about, you know, the kind of things, I suppose, which are very complex and complicated in the sense of the legalities or otherwise. My argument is that, you know, there's a Keir Starmer's statement yesterday about how he didn't want to give any details away of the Rudakubana case because he was frightened that they might affect a trial. I take that point, but I also am slightly nervous, having been a journalist for many, many decades, that I don't want to see the government or the judiciary basically saying you can't talk about anything at all to do with this case. You can't mention any of the details of any case as soon as somebody is arrested. I think that's, you know, sort of anti-freedom of the press. I think it's informative. And I think the public deserve to know certain things when somebody is arrested, don't you?
Yes. I could stop there.
Thank you. Well, that's really all I really need you to say.
I think what I'd just like to say is there is, I mean, lawyers are known for saying this. There's a balance between a couple of rights here. The right to know, obviously, and the other one is the right to a fair trial.
Yeah.
It's not, Keir Starmer was DPP for a long time, and therefore he's very experienced. So that you have to bear that in mind. But I think in this particular case, he would have been entitled to say to journalists, at this stage, all I can say is there's a potential, that's all, a potential for this being a terror-related case. The problem he faced, and the police faced, was that this, as far as one can tell, and he's yet to be sentenced, was a lone individual. So it wasn't a conspiracy or anything like that. And the real problem was whether, and of course this goes back to the definition of terrorism, and the base of the allegation of terrorism is whether you're wanting to influence government for political, racial, or whatever reasons. Now, I think obviously you can see in this case why there was a problem, because they find Al-Qaeda bomb-making guidance and so on, a book about that. They find ricin. It looks pretty much as though it might be, but it looks, and now, of course, looking back, they're able to say in the context that it was this individual, but that doesn't mean to say he hasn't got a terror-related, because if you possess items that might be of use to a terrorist, then you're guilty of a terrorist-related offence.
Right.
Now, I think Keir was perfectly entitled at the time, if he wanted to say, it's potentially related to terrorism, right, but I can't give you the details. The problem about police conferences has often been in the past, they give too much detail and it's very adverse to an individual who's been arrested.
Yes. And I think the problem as well is that, you know, in other cases, and I'm not necessarily including ones that Keir Starmer was involved in, but in other cases, you know, the word terrorist has been used pretty quickly after the event, even sometimes before a charge has been brought. You know, when Joe Cox was killed, he was a terrorist, the guy that did it. He was charged with terror-related offences in the same way that other incidents have happened, lone wolf incidents, as you might say, and the word terrorism has come out. And so I'm just wary of the fact that, you know, having done this job a long time, there used to be a lot less concern about somebody after they'd been arrested than there seems to be now. You know, the difference between being arrested and being charged was quite stark. You know, when I was working in Fleet Street, as I did for many years, when a charge was brought, suddenly that was when all the curtains came down, the sub judice kicked in, and you couldn't do anything. But while somebody hadn't been charged, there were quite a lot of things you could say.
Yeah, well, I have to say I'm on the other side of the fence, and I've been very wary the other way, that because there was such perceived freedom prior to charge, all sorts of things, I can give you many cases where material got into the press and so on, which, not just the press, but the media generally, that was, again, potentially risking a trial. So it's a very fine balance.
Yeah.
but he could have gone further here. There are other situations where the investigation itself would be prejudiced if material detail was let out. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is you may need to actually present a lot of detail because for example, here, Ricin, in Salisbury, it's Novichok. You want to warn the public about the dangers.
Yes.
So these are all factors you have to bear in mind all the time.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that Keir may have erred on the side of caution. Of course, he would say, as an ex-DPP, well, that's my job to do that. I don't want to prejudice anything. But on the other hand, you as a journalist would say quite rightly, well, we need to do a little bit more. And of course, that if a little bit more had been said, it would have, I think, circumvented some of the outrageous stuff that was put out.
It would have done, yeah.
And you know, which has had to be withdrawn since, you know, the immigration point, the Farage point that he was asking, you know, all that would have been undermined if he'd actually gone that extra mile.
But that's my contention, really, that his caution has actually caused a bigger problem in a way. And I think we've seen over the course of years that there are certainly indications whenever an incident happens, when the police are reluctant to give a name or when the police are reluctant to release information, the public, rightly or wrongly, jump to all sorts of conclusions. And it would be surely better. I've always said, you know, I much prefer the antiseptic of light rather than darkness. I much prefer, you know, knowledge rather than ignorance. I much prefer facts rather than nothing, you know. And I think we need to be careful that we don't end up going down this route where we don't get to do anything. I mean, I've had a couple of journalists on today arguing with me saying, don't question the CPS, don't question the authorities, don't question anything. Well, I'm sorry, that's not what I was raised to do.
No, I think you're entitled to ask questions, but they're also entitled not to answer them if, and I mean, the wording has to be remembered, the Contempt of Court Act, that's the test. The test is, does the disclosure you're about to make or the comment or whatever pose a substantial risk of serious prejudice? Now, that's the test. Now, of course, if the core issue is going to be whether this man is a terrorist or not, then you've got to be very careful what you put out at the beginning because, you know, people jump on bandwagons.
Right.
So supposing he had gone a step further, the same factions that got themselves onto the streets all over the country for what the judges called idiotic rioting, then I think it may have caused a backlash of a different kind. And obviously he could have said he's not an immigrant, and he could have said all the things he's not. And of course, you know, by the time you've gone through a whole list of what he's not, it's all a bit ridiculous. So I think you're entitled to ask questions, but you're also got to bet you as a journalist. I'm not saying you're not. I think most journalists are responsible. In the mainstream, they're responsible. You understand that there's a limit. And if the DPP says, I'm sorry, I can't give you more detail because it would prejudice the trial, you'd have stopped there, wouldn't you?
Of course, as long as the indicators in all of these things are that they're being entirely truthful. But we also know that there have been allegations of two-tier policing, there have been allegations of some people being treated differently on marches and other people being treated differently. You know, we also know, you know, it's not a perfect world that we live in, Michael, and so therefore sometimes I don't take the word of the authorities and
no,
keep
I'm
quiet,
not suggesting
you know,
you should.
because imagine if we had done all that, and some of the cases that you've been successful in, and some of the cases that you've brought would never have been brought if that was the case. And so all I'm saying is that the public's kind of trust in the government right now is pretty much at an all-time low, and it wasn't any better when the other lot were in. I'm not saying it's particularly about Keir Starmer, you know, but politicians in general, I think, need to do a lot more and do a much better job, as do the police, as do the CPS, in convincing us that there aren't, you know, other issues that they're just not telling us about, you know, because I think that's what breeds this kind of discontent and sometimes conspiracy theories.
I think as a general principle, there's no issue with that. The problem here is you've got the potential for a trial. That's all. And therefore, there has to be an element of difference. It's different to this, if you like, debate that I had with you this morning. You know, of course. And in general terms, I'd be with you. I have no particular love of politicians, I have to say, and I think everybody knows that. But at the same time, I am conscious that as a lawyer, there are certain principles that are enshrined. And if you were on trial, you'd want the fairness of the system to kick in to prevent you facing all sorts of false allegations that are being made by the right wing or whoever, on the streets of the United Kingdom. So that's the thing that has to, one always has to remember, if you were on trial, would you want this or not?
No, indeed. But again, I mean, the trial would be about what the allegations were in a courtroom. It wouldn't matter what they were being said outside it, really, at the end of the day. But we could do this all day, and I'm sure you've probably got better things to do. So thank you very much indeed, Michael.